Hi, this is Carly Opson at the University of Arizona. The special education process involves a lot of regulation, and because of those regulations, there's a requirement to complete forms that document that we've actually followed regulation. That's probably a good thing, although it can be difficult at times. What we're going to do today is take a look at some of those special education forms and the requirements and variations because different districts can require different forms. Different schools could require different forms, but they all refer to the same special education and IEP elements. So one of our objectives today is that by the time we're done, I hope that you can locate IEP elements on IEPs from a variety of schools or districts. Also, these requirements have to come under the guidance of timelines. There are certain timelines necessary to completing the legal requirements of IDEA. So today we want to take a look at those. And finally, there's a not well understood requirement called prior written notice. And I hope that by the time we finish talking today, you'll understand a little bit more about when prior written notice is required and when you should provide it. All IEPs, no matter where you encounter them, should have the same elements. It's kind of like writing a will. You could write your own will if you chose. It's probably better to go and get one or get a lawyer to help you prepare a will that has all the appropriate elements. You can write your own IEP as long as you included all of these elements. But if you work for a school, a district, or a state, they've already probably created paperwork that includes all of these elements and has passed by their lawyers to make sure that those pieces of paper work through those elements of the IEP. There's also the notion that we've talked about before that there's good paperwork and there's bad paperwork. There's paperwork that helps people get their job done, and there's paperwork that gets in the way. So your district may be trying to create paperwork that helps you get your job done. Let's look at what these common elements of an IEP are. One is demographic information, and that's just obvious, right? You want the basic information about the student and about the parent or guardian. Another piece is documentation of participation. So it's required in an IEP that it be a team process and that certain people be involved. Certainly the student, the parent, a general education teacher, a special education teacher, public education representative, that's usually a school administrator or somebody who can commit funding and placement. And then an interpreter of evaluation data, and that is usually a school psychologist. And then any number of other people, whether it be a consultant, an advocate, or a related service provider, who we think it's important to have at the meeting. The PLAF, we've talked about a PLAF before, but it's where things all begin in terms of documenting student performance, determining their needs, and then eventually writing goals, present levels of academic achievement, and functional performance. Consideration of special factors. Consideration of special factors is a part of the document that ensures that we take a look at some distinctly special needs for kids, like assistive technology, communication needs, behavioral needs. If they're an English language learner, what are their language needs? If they are deaf or hearing impaired, what are their language and communication needs? And if they are blind or visually impaired, What are their needs in terms of Braille instruction? And this is hopefully this is a piece of paperwork that helps you document that you actually have or considered each of these. And that's the point here. That's why the language is called consideration of special factors. Whatever paperwork you use, it should allow you to document that you have actually considered each of these. Annual goals. So flowing from the information provided in the PLAF, we create measurable annual goals. And you'll see here ESY. That's extended school year services. And that's kind of a whole nother topic, but it has to do with providing a student with additional educational services if it's determined that their educational services provided during the regular school year were either not provided as they should have been or were insufficient to help a child work toward their goal. Progress reporting. So on an IEP, you actually have to document not the progress of the student, that happens elsewhere, but you have to document that there are going to be periodic reports about the student's progress. You have to say, how often am I going to provide those reports? Instructional assessment and accommodations. This is a part of an IEP where you have to document what accommodations are going to be used, and are they for instruction or will they be for assessment? Participation in state testing. On an IEP, you have to note whether or not the student will participate in state testing, and this can be a really touchy subject depending on the state and the district. I'd encourage you to look to guidance with your state or district directly in terms of how they want you to implement this section of the IEP. Special education and related services. So there's a section on the IEP in which you have to write down how much time and the initial date and the ending date that a student is going to spend in special education services. So where it says frequency or amount, you have to actually calculate minutes of services. And then when someone comes back to you to determine whether or not a child has received the amount of service they're supposed to receive, they're going to refer to this section of the IEP. They're going to say this child is supposed to get 30 minutes a day of one-on-one direct instruction in math. And you've got to show that that student is actually receiving 30 minutes a day one-on-one. Explanation of non-regular participation, and this is also combined with LRE, which we'll look at in just a minute. But the IEP requires some explanation of the extent, if any, to which the student will not participate with other children. So this goes hand in hand with the LRE, so that you're noting specific things to suggest in the IEP this child actually is in the least restrictive environment. Finally, transition planning. Any child who is at least 16 or younger in some states, districts, or schools is required to have a transition plan. This section actually becomes a rather large section and a really important section. And we'll talk about it in much greater detail in this course. So those are the common elements of an IEP. Let's take a look at timelines, because all of these paperwork and all of these procedures have to fall within a certain period of time. Actually, what you'll see is some of them have to fall within a specific period of time. Sometimes that period of time is not actually mentioned, and at some points it's kind of a loose description of what the time should be. Let's start with the 45-day screening. Any kid who shows up at a school must receive a screening within 45 calendar days. Usually this happens closer to the end of the 45 calendar days because if a teacher receives a new student, they want to have them for at least a month or two so that they have a better understanding of who that student is. But this is a broad screening meant to find kids who might need additional assistance. Here is a sample student screening from the state of Arizona, the one that is suggested for use by the state. You can see all the elements that are on it: vision, hearing screening, communication screening, cognitive or academic screening, adaptive developmental screening, social and behavioral screening, motor. You review a student's transfer records. You give them a primary language survey to determine their home language, the language they use in home, and the language they use most frequently. And then there's a place to note administrative actions. Right? Once that screening is completed in that first 45 days, once it's completed, you have 10 days to notify the parents of the result of that screening. Now, if you want to do something with that screening information, if you need to send the child to child study team for some assistance for the gen ed teacher, say you identify something behaviorally for that student and academically, there is not a specific timeline during which you have to refer that child to child study team or student study team. Just as there is not a time that's specific from which a student is referred to student study team over to special education. That makes some sense, because if a child is in student study team, we're trying out different interventions. And we may need more time to try more interventions. We may not need to try interventions for very long before we refer for special education services. There's no set timeline there. But once an evaluation request is made, or after a referral is made for services, special education services, and there is parental consent to evaluate, you've got to do one or two things. You either, as a school, have to refuse to evaluate in a timely manner, and we'll talk about what PWN means later, or you have 60 calendar days in which to complete that consent request or evaluation request and do all the evaluation and determine eligibility, right? So you either refuse in a timely manner, or you have 60 days in which to get that evaluation done and meet again to determine eligibility. Once eligibility is determined, you have another 30 calendar days in which to develop the IEP. Now, there is a mechanism to request a 30-day extension. Let's say you finish with the evaluation and you meet as a team and you decide you need more information because there wasn't enough good evaluation information, or there are other things that the team wants to look at. You can request from the parent permission to have another 30 days. But once the IEP is developed, the timeline for IEP implementation is just as soon as possible. Okay? If a parent requests to review student records, the timeline is 15 to 30 days when you must have a meeting to review the IEP. So as you can see, sometimes I'm in here are very specific, some float a little bit, some have no particular dates attached to them at all. Let's look at a couple more forms. Yes, more forms. There are a few more forms that are not the IEP, but you'll see they fit in with the timeline and they fit in with procedures that help us move through the special education process. One of those is prior written notice. We'll talk about this again in a moment. In fact, you can download from D2L a whole manual from the state of Arizona that describes how to write prior written notice documents. But basically, the prior written notice is used to inform the parents of any decision made by the school and the team that proposes to initiate a change or refuses to initiate or change special education services. Procedural safeguards. Lots of jokes made about this in special education. Parents will say that they wallpaper their rooms with these procedural safeguard notices. Basically, the law says that at least once a year, you've got to sit down with a parent, hand them a list of their procedural safeguards under special education law. And it's going to be a long and lengthy document, and you're supposed to walk them through it and explain all of the safeguards. A referral form. We've mentioned that before you get consent to evaluate, somebody refers a child for special education services. Well, it's got to happen and be recorded in some way, and it's recorded on a referral form. So wherever you work as a special education professional, they will have a form that gets filled out or some mechanism for referring a child for special education services. A meeting notice. There's got to be a record of asking people to come to a meeting. You've got to invite people somehow. It's like sending an invitation to a party. And just like a party, for the guest of honor, you wouldn't just set a date and then say, guest of honor, come if you can or if you can't. And in this case, the guest of honor is the parent. And so it's really probably a good idea to get a hold of a parent ahead of time, find out when they're available, and then schedule the meeting around them. So that list of all these people that attend the IEP meeting, every person has to receive a notice for the meeting. And you should keep track of those and keep a record of the fact that this person was invited to the meeting. Consent to evaluate. So if you remember the timeline, that's a really important record to have, is the consent to evaluate, because it sets off the 60-day timeline toward a meeting in which you discuss the evaluation results and determine eligibility. So this is a really important document in which you sit together as a team and you get permission from the parent to evaluate in all of the areas that you think are important for evaluating the student. It may even be necessary to go back and get, if you missed an area, or if the team decides later as they're doing evaluations they need to evaluate another area, you may need to get additional permission from the parent for evaluations. And then finally, consent for services. Now this is something that is often built into an actual IEP form. But you'll note from our timeline again that this is another really important date to be documented. The date at which the parent consents for services, because from the date at which the parent consents for services to the date that the IEP is implemented should be ASAP. It should happen right away. Um, You'll notice here that there's also a spot for the parent to revoke or deny services. So in this case, they wanted to create a form that could be used to consent for services or for revocation or denial of services. So you can see there's not only the IEP, but there's really a need to document at each step in the special education process what is going on. Let's talk really quickly, and I'll let you look through this at your leisure in some of the documents that I provide at our website. But at the special education process and about prior written notice. So this is a flow chart that is provided from the State of Arizona Technical Manual on Special Education. And most states will have a technical manual that leads you through their process and each of the procedures and forms that should be filed as you move through their process. So make sure you get that. Whatever school district you work in, whatever state you work in, make sure you find out what the process is that they choose to use, the forms that they want to use. Take a look at them and make sure that they cover all the bases. Let's take a look now at some scenarios about prior written notice. So in this scenario, the teacher assistance team has been working with Jane's teacher to increase Jane's academic performance in the general education classroom. Jane has not been referred for special education services yet. She's just working with the teacher assistance team or the child study team or student study team. And there have been a variety of different interventions implemented, and they've not been effective. Jane, though, is now being referred for an evaluation to determine if she has a disability, and the Public Education Agency plans to conduct an evaluation. So the teacher assistance team has worked with Jane. They've run through several interventions. Nothing has worked the way they wanted it to, and now they want to refer Jane for special education services. Do they also have to send home with Jane a prior written notice? The answer is yes. So the prior written notice documents any proposal to initiate or change or refusal to initiate or change services or evaluation for a student related to special education. And I'll let you read through this on your own, but you'll note that there are specific things that are supposed to be included in a prior written notice, and that's due to law and statute. In this part of the scenario, as it sometimes happens, the parent may wish to start the evaluation process more quickly than school personnel. In this case, Jack's parents requested that the school bypass an intervention process in the child study team or student study team and move ahead to do a special education evaluation. And Jack's parents have submitted a written request for the evaluation, and the agency representatives review Jack's current level of performance with the appropriate personnel. The team determined that a special education evaluation was not warranted. So the school looked at information that was already available, even after the parents requested that they move to special education. The team that was looking at Jack's academic and functional performance in the teacher assistance team said, we're still working with Jack. We're not ready to move to a special education referral yet, even though the parent requested it. We're going to say to the parent that we refuse to go ahead with the evaluation. Do they have to file a prior written notice? Yes, they do, because they're going to refuse to initiate services. And again, I'll leave you to read this prior written notice yourself. In this scenario, the multidisciplinary evaluation team that includes Jane's parents has reviewed existing data, determined that they need more information to identify Jane's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance and eligibility. Basically, they've done some evaluation. They've come up to the 30-day period and they want to extend that and do some more testing because they think they need it to determine whether or not Jane really is a student with a disability. So if they want to extend it, if they want to collect more evaluation information, do they have to file a prior written notice? Yes, because they are proposing to initiate or change services to a student. They want to collect more evaluation information. So what's the conclusion? It's all pretty confusing, isn't it? One thing I'd suggest is that when you start as a special education professional, that you work with a mentor, someone who understands the system, understands the elements of an IEP, the timelines, and the paperwork that's used in the state, district, or school in which you're working. Second, I suggest you keep a calendar, either paper or electronic, with student information to keep all those dates organized and in mind. Third, I'd suggest you download and refer to the ADE guidelines and manuals if you're working in Arizona, or get the manuals and information in the district or state in which you're going to work. Finally, if you have specific questions about procedures, go to your mentor, go to your district special education director, because they're the ones who will be able to provide you with answers because they've got a lot of experience.